Afternoon. Thanks for taking time to join us today. My name is Mandla Deskins. I'm with Take on Wall Street, a coalition of over 50 organizations united to restructure our economy so it works for white, black, and brown working people and not just Wall Street and the wealthy. So, a very tall task, but important. Throughout this pandemic, we have seen two economic realities laid to bear, probably more than what most of us have seen in a long time. On one hand, we have struggling working people, barely making ends meet, worried about eviction, not having jobs, experiencing food insecurity. And while on the other hand, we have Wall Street and the wealthy taking an ever larger share, um, literally flying to the moon during this time to watch people suffer from space. We are doing our parts as advocates, Take on Wall Street and our coalition members at the national level, fighting for changes to the tax code and ending predatory practices. But we know that fighting Wall Street and the big banks is only part of the battle. In order to truly fight Wall Street greed and all that comes along with that, we need to actually get Wall Street tentacles out of all the different parts of our society so we can truly invest in our communities and build the economy that works for all of us. So, with all that being said, I'm super excited to moderate this panel discussion, The Power of Public Banks to Accelerate Progressive Movements, with the four amazing leaders I have joining me, leaders, advocates, activists, all of the above that I share the screen with today. So, a quick round of introductions and then we'll get into it. So, joining me on this panel today, and I'll ask you when I say your name, you could just wave, just in case people aren't reading. We have Trinity Tran, co-founder and lead organizer of Public Bank LA and the California Public Banking Alliance. We have Jackie Fielder, co-founder of the San Francisco Public Banking Coalition. She's frozen, but I know she's waving. We have Naveen Agrawal. Sorry, I knew I was going to mess up your name. Affordable housing developer and lead organizer with Public Bank Los Angeles. And last but not least, we have Julian LaRosa, co-founder of the National Public Banking Alliance and organizer with the San Francisco Public Banking Coalition. So quickly, one little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We'll have some time for some Q&A at the end of the conversation. So please put things in the chat and we will try our best to get to them. All right. So Trinity, can you start us off with a little bit about the history of this movement and why public banks are so critical to communities?
Yes, thank you, Manla, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. There's been a lot of movement happening this week in the public banking space. We're coming out of two very huge victories for the movement. On Monday, Governor Newsom signed AB 1177, the California Public Banking Act, into law. And that bill establishes universal free banking for all. And then Tuesday, Los Angeles City Council unanimously voted to move forward with the creation of the city's public bank business plan and viability study. So this is two huge back-to-back wins from California, the fifth largest economy in the world, and Los Angeles, the largest city in California and one of the world's economic power centers. So this really helps further legitimize public banking as a policy, as a viable solution that will keep profits working for the people and invest in our communities. So this week's victories from California and Los Angeles will have huge implications for the future of finance. A few years ago, very few people knew what a public bank was or had heard of public banking. And now with the legislative successes that we've landed in just a few short years and this growing momentum that we're witnessing that's building from the grassroots, from LA to SF and cities up and down the state of California, across the nation, we're seeing public banking gaining traction as a practical, as a common sense solution to save cities money, and while simultaneously being able to invest in to fund social and environmental priorities from racial equity, to sustainability initiatives that positively impact our communities at a local level. So what's a public bank? I'll break it down super simple. It's a financial institution that's owned and operated by a local government, a city, a region, or a state government. Public banks are managed in the public interest. So they're required to invest in and lend to the areas that they serve. And right now, when our cities want to fund public projects like build roads, bridges, and schools, they have to turn to private markets for financing. So to build the things we need, currently our options are to borrow and increase debt, to raise taxes, or to cut essential services, none of which are ideal. So public banks would essentially cut out Wall Street as a middleman, serving as both a depository for our city's funds, as well as a public lender for the local government's borrowing needs. And a public bank can do what banks do, which is leverage their deposit and lending power. They do it to benefit the community. This will help deploy funds directly back into our localities rather than having to rely on Wall Street, because we know that the interests of Wall Street banks don't align with public interests. They're interested in short-term profits. Their goal is to maximize payoffs for out-of-state shareholders rather than investing in our own neighborhoods. Our work, just a little bit of background on how we got here. Our work with public banking is rooted in the divestment movement. We see this as the spiritual evolution of the divestment movement, the movement that rose across this country at the end of 2016, 2017, in solidarity with Standing Rock Indigenous allies who were fighting against oil pipelines from being built. And Jackie will dive into the Indigenous-led divestment movement more. In Los Angeles, we were inspired by, moved by what was happening in Standing Rock, inspired by Kshama Sawant's move, the Seattle City Council, when she launched an initiative to divest the city of Seattle from Wells Fargo. And that inspired us in Los Angeles, seeing what was happening. We knew that by virtue of Los Angeles banking with Wells Fargo, which was our bank that we primarily bank with, that our taxpayers were essentially complicit to these destructive actions. And as the second largest city in the US, divesting from one of the most powerful big banks, one of the financiers of DAPL, would send a really loud and resounding message to all big banks that if you finance harm to our communities, we will fight back and we will defund you. So through Divest LA, within 4 months of the campaign, we succeeded in moving $40 million in holdings out of Wells Fargo. And then 6 months later, we disqualified Wells Fargo from submitting an RFP for the city's commercial banking services. We were able to disqualify them because of we made the city stick to the CRA rating. And Wells Fargo, or at that time, Wells Fargo, of course, had a substandard CRA rating. So divested from Wells Fargo, disqualified them from submitting for an RFP. But we knew that Los Angeles moving its money from Wells Fargo to another big bank was not a solution. That the only real form of divestment was for the city of Los Angeles to divest from Wall Street altogether by creating a bank that would be accountable and transparent and socially environmentally responsible in its mandates. Currently, cities and counties in California and across the nation hold billions of public money in Wall Street banks, and these Wall Street banks charge our local governments large fees to be able to hold deposits and perform basic banking services for cities, perform cash management services. And this is money that is essentially being extracted from our communities to line the pockets of out-of-state private shareholders. And this movement is about taking the power back from private interests and putting it in the hands of the people where it belongs. Building.
Trinity, you were buzzing in and out a little bit. Sorry,
You
everyone.
hear
We
me?
have a little bit of technical difficulties, which happens. Yep, I think we can hear you now.
No. Can
Looks like you might be back.
you hear me now?
Yep, you're back. Okay, sorry, everyone. We dropped Trinity for a quick second. I assume she'll be coming right back. You know, it is the virtual world, so we
Can you?
have technical difficulties. Yes, you
Are you?
look back now. Okay,
Are you? Am I back?
you're back. No worries. Happens.
Okay, you can hear me.
Yep.
Okay. Where did I leave off? Let me just dive into AB 1177. So within the past few years, we've built a really incredible network of both alliances at the grassroots level with organizational support from social justice groups, racial justice group, environmental groups, as well as political allies tapping into both kind of establishment democratic organizations to help build the political capital behind public banking. And the inside outside game that we leveraged was really a critical part in how we were able to get AB 857 passed in one legislative session, AB 1177 that Newsom just signed passed in one legislative session. This is done as an entirely all volunteer group, as an unfunded organization. So it really is a powerful example of how grassroots organizing can be very, very effective, even with limited resources. So AB 1177 is a little bit about the bill that Newsom just signed, the California Public Banking Option Act. We led this bill with SEIU California, which is the California arm of SEIU, one of the largest unions in the nation. And AB 1177 was historic because it's the first bill in the nation to provide universal banking services. What this bill now starts the process with Governor Newsom's signature. Now that it's law, the state treasurer is going to convene a commission to conduct a market analysis to start the program, to start the process for the Cal account program. Once this is implemented, this will create a free bank accounts for basic services for all Californians, check cashing, debit accounts, direct deposit. Why is this bill important? 1 out of 4 in this nation, in California, so about 10 million people who don't have either access or adequate access to a checking and savings account. They have to turn to high cost, predatory alternative services because they either can't meet the account minimum balances, they don't have the necessary identification because they're undocumented. All of these restrictions prevent ordinary working class folks from being able to access the financial system. So this bill is a big step forward, especially for low income people of color who don't have access. This bill is a big step forward in our work in democratizing finance. So AB 1177 is one part of the public banking ecosystem. This bill will bank the general public, while on the other hand, we are also working to implement banks at the local municipal level, which was established through AB 857. This is the bill that AB 857, the California Public Banking Act, was the bill that we led, we drafted, we wrote the bill, we led the bill, got it passed in 2019. And that was another historic bill because that was the first in the nation. That was the first bill in the nation that enabled cities and counties and localities to form public banks. A huge landmark win, especially since, again, it was done in one legislative session with Wall Street opposing the bill and lobbying it at every turn. That bill now is being implemented by cities like LA and San Francisco and East Bay, as well as Central Coast. And all of our work, again, as public banking activists, has been done as volunteers. But I do want to add that some of you may have heard the breaking news that happened on Tuesday. So Newsom signed 1177 on Monday. On Tuesday, LA City Council now voted unanimously to move forward with the city-owned bank, which could potentially be the first municipal bank, since none have been founded yet any number of cities could technically be the first, but LA will certainly be the largest in Los Angeles. So our city now will issue a request for proposal in 60 days, in 2 months, to hire consultants to write the public bank business plan and viability study. And the consultants will engage in a community stakeholder process over the course of the next months to ensure that this bank is going to be democratically designed, and that the general public will have input on the priorities and the principles of the LA Public Bank. And this, creating a business plan / viability study is the first step for municipals seeking to form public bank. And that following the guidelines of the AB 857 law that we established in 2019. So this is a really exciting moment for the movement, because the cities, localities, city governments are taking concrete steps to move this forward. It's moved from idea to policy, into law, and now implementation in just a few short years. So as I mentioned, LA is moving forward. SF is also moving forward. East Bay is putting together their business plan, as well as Central Coast cities. They've formed an alliance of about 9 cities and counties, and they're working to form a regional public bank. So it's a really exciting moment as activists and advocates are working with city council members and supervisors up and down the state of California. This is really the furthest the public banking movement has come in 100 years, in a century, since the Bank of North Dakota was created. And our financial system really has caused widespread devastation, and has only served the interests of the private interests of a few. With public banking, we are mobilizing public revenues to serve public interests. And when you move the power from a small handful of people and into the control of the many, we're creating a possibility for a better world. It really is, public banking really is an idea whose time has come, and the movements that's risen and the momentum that's built in just a few years is really an incredible testament to this. And we are ultimately fighting for a new, evolved financial system that supports human rights, economic equity, economic justice, and equality. So go check out California Public Banking Alliance or publicbankla.org and stay connected to the movement. Or if and we can also help you direct you to resources to join at the local level, or to start a public banking group. But join the fight. We are literally in the midst of a financial revolution in the United States. Thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute and forgot how to get off. Trinity, thanks so much for just that plethora of information, and then really bringing us back to what has actually happened in California and how we can see what success looks like. It really helps to bring back an idea that some may say, well, this is not going to happen. This is too idealistic, but we see it happening here in California for the first time, like you said, in a really long time. Jackie, we want to turn to you next. And one thing that a lot of folks may not know is the connection between the indigenous-led divestment movement and public banking, and also how public banking supports a sustainable economy and the Green New Deal. So can you talk to us a little bit about that? I guess I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Mandala. Thank you, Trinity, for that awesome introduction. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, cool. So I'm going to share my screen because I have a presentation. And my name is Jackie Fielder, she, her pronouns. I'm based here in Yelamu, or so-called San Francisco. Co-founded the San Francisco Public Bank Coalition a number of years ago in 2017. And this is our story. Back in 2016, we saw Indigenous water protectors face down hundreds of law enforcement officers to protect our treaty lands. I'm actually a member of the 3 affiliated tribes, which is a tribe at the start of the Duconnexus pipeline. So it was a personal undertaking for me. And as Trinity mentioned, we were all really inspired by the divestment movement that bloomed from Standing Rock. At the time, the tribe was the first entity to put forward a resolution to separate itself from Wells Fargo, and an organizer named Matt Remley and another one named Rachel Heaton in Seattle started to pressure their own city council to do the same. And that's actually how the modern municipal-focused divestment movement, as of recently, really popped off. So it was obviously an atrocious example of Indigenous rights violations, the law enforcement using water cannons on people. And we'll get to this later, but something that folks often forget is that the Public Bank of North Dakota, which is the only state government bank in the country, in the United States, actually enabled a lot of this because they allowed funding, they enabled funding to the state government to deploy this kind of violence. Anyway, this is the pathway of the pipeline. As you can see, it affects a number of reservations, both upstream and downstream. And this was the biggest kind of, I think, inspiration for a lot of us that we're looking at the banks behind the pipeline. And on the left, you can see all the lists of the banks and how their funding flowed into the companies that own the pipeline. And of course, this wasn't the only example of human rights violations that we've seen banks back. This is a private detention facility at the height of the immigration and human rights violations during the Trump administration. This is the Seattle local movement as led by Indigenous organizers here protesting outside of Wells Fargo. And that's how we came to be in San Francisco and the Defund Apple Coalition. So we mobilized to our own city hall to advocate for our city to divest from Wall Street banks. Of course, the problem was we didn't have an alternative that was as big as our city ordinances demanded and our state laws demanded. However, we still made some successes in passing a divestment resolution that said the city intends at some point to make that divestment a reality. So looking into the particulars of the San Francisco Pooled Investment Fund, you can see that our average daily balance, at least during June of 2020, was around $12.4 billion. And as far as investments, aside from treasuries and federal agencies, which make up a lot of the investments, there's also these like private investment products. And those are the things that are held by major Wall Street banks. $1 billion. How the heck? These are all the banks that San Francisco with. Of course, then came AB 857, such a blessing. It finally defined public banks at the state level. Thanks to the work of Trinity and others with the California Public Banking Alliance, we finally got a definition and a process for what we need to establish a bank. And first off, we need a license from the state treasurer. And then this is kind of how I've been thinking about it here in San Francisco. So in order to get a license, what AB 857 did was define the term public bank to mean this. And in short, we would need a purpose statement, a viability study, FDIC insurance, governance structure, business plan, and so on. So at this point in the struggle in San Francisco, we are at the business plan. So we just got an ordinance passed this year to seat a working group that is staffed with consultants, and we anticipate them to be able to get to work on the business plan and governance structure and all of the various plans in 2022. So they'll spend all of 2022 focusing on that. And in addition to the business plan, we'll need obviously the capitalization. This number is pretty flexible depending on who you talk to, but we anticipate to be able to capitalize the bank in some form. And again, the working group will look into the particulars of that, but it could be anywhere from the pooled investment fund that we saw earlier, or a mixture of that and bonds, or a mixture of that and tax revenue. It really depends on what we decide as a city. And then, of course, to get even to these, to actually get the political will to back these things, we really need political will from our Board of Supervisors. For you and in your own city, it may be like your city council. And then, of course, we also need political will from voters, which looks like more like a campaign. And then supporting all of this is, of course, education, which is where the San Francisco Public Bank Coalition comes in. So now that you are caught up about where we are in San Francisco, I want to talk a little bit about how we can decarbonize via public banking. And I draw heavily from Thomas Moraw's bank that just came out this year. It's remarkable. It's called Public Banks Decarbonization, Definancialization, and Democratization. And he says there's no lending strategy is ideologically or socially neutral, but is instead deeply political in its economic and class-divided social implications. Whereas private and corporatized financial institutions lend only to bankable projects and thus have a single bottom line based on expected returns, a pro-public bank can have more options. So projects may or may not be bankable per se. Returns may form but one of several considerations. And that's essentially what you've heard so far about public banks, is they have the public mandate. They're not constricted by the requirement to generate and maximize profits. So he outlines 8 different ways of lending for green and just transitions. And here he breaks down the types of lending that a public bank can do. So there's standard loans, which must be repaid. And I want you to make a mental note of this one for later. Standard loans must be repaid. They can be at like discount or not discount rates, also called concessional. There's development loans, which are often concessional and repayable, but they could also blend funds from different parts of the government or donor funds, as well as investor capital. And then there's official donors, which means that the public bank is essentially just a channel. And then there's grants, transfers, and subsidies. No need to repay those. And then we have equity, which involves the public bank taking a direct ownership stake in a project. Then there's public-public collaboration. So that can mean the public bank partners with a certain agency, public agency in the local or state government. And then there's technical assistance. So agreements to provide expertise and assistance at little or no cost. And then lastly, bond issuance, which involves providing financial instruments for investors who want to specifically channel their funds directly into certified sustainable development and social impact projects. So that can be like green bonds. Also note for later. All right, so what are some examples abroad? KfW, I won't even attempt to say it in German, but their acronym is KfW. They were actually established post-World War II by the United States' Marshall Plan and the funds for reconstruction of Germany. And what they did is, instead of spending that money right away, they put it into a public bank. And regarding energy efficiency, so in 10 years, over 4 million housing units have either been built or refurbished to make them more energy efficient. And that looks like 100 billion euros about there. As well, public banks have provided over 72% of the financing for Germany's transition. In 2007 to 2009, KfW funded all of Germany's investment in solar photovoltaic. And I wanted to bring back that mental note when we were on the slide around loans. So 70% of their loans are traditional lending. That means that you're expected to pay the loan back. And then the 25% is grants. The other is a mix of equity and other stuff. An interesting point is that they don't have public-private partnerships. And that is also a hallmark of truly public banks, is that they don't just socialize and guarantee profits for the private larger banks. They make sure that other considerations are first. They also have green bonds financed by the proceeds from their loans, and they have a remarkable power to leverage government subsidies by something like 20-fold. So they can get a $1 billion subsidy and then turn that around by 20-fold. And then you have the Banco Popular in Costa Rica, which is actually worker owned and has pretty strong gender mandates all the way to the top of its governance structure. And they have green lending facilities for micro, small, and medium sized businesses, in addition to financing for community energy co ops and local residential solar installations. Last but not least, there's the promise of social housing, which is basically housing that can be mixed income and owned and operated by the government and can guarantee housing as a human right. We've seen so many brilliant examples abroad. This is, of course, Vienna. But a public bank essentially could basically help guarantee housing as a human right, because unlike Wall Street capital, it's more patient and it could reduce the cost of affordable housing because of that public mandate. Well, if you want to follow us, you can go to sfpublicbank.org and follow us online. But thank you so much for attending.
Thanks so much, Jackie. Lots of great information there as well. Naveen, you have some big shoes to fill following up these two powerful women organizers. And so I guess one thing Jackie said towards the end was talking about communities and housing in particular. And as an affordable housing developer and Public Bank LA organizer, can you give us some perspective on public banks and how public banks can support Main Street with an emphasis on historically marginalized communities?
Sure. Thanks for setting that up. And thank you to Netroots and to this group. I'm honored to be included, obviously with some great speakers, but also like activist leaders in this movement and in other movements. I think to your question, Mama, affordable housing is one of the vantage points to view something like a public financial infrastructure, which is really what public banking is about. As Jackie just mentioned, like the capital that's available, the money that goes into affordable housing is all profit seeking. So I work in affordable housing. We do a lot of acquisition rehab, Section 8 properties. And the reason we're able to do it is purely profit-seeking behavior. Nonprofits, when I've worked for nonprofits, are much more hamstringed in terms of what they're actually able to accomplish. And overall, the industry is tied to how much tax appetite does a bank have? Most of the new construction affordable housing that is built in this country is built using tax credit equity. We're saying to a bank, a private investor, you don't need to pay taxes to this if you buy a tax credit now. It turns out that means that if you change the tax code to lower taxes, lower the corporate tax rate, as happened in 2017, there's much less appetite to build affordable housing. It also means if a crisis like a pandemic hits, a bank chooses to lend or invest less in affordable housing because they're not sure what's going to happen. And I worked for a bank at the beginning of the pandemic. What we said was we need to make more money on our affordable housing loans. We need to make fewer loans, and we need to invest less in affordable housing, which is exactly the opposite of what we needed as a society, as a country, as a state at that time. So I think if you think about it, if you think about affordable housing from this lens of a kind of product mismatch, commercial banks are out there to make speculative investments that derive profit. If you're able to take the public mandate and apply that to a capital framework so that you're able to, that basically enables you to think about, well, what are all the gaps? So to drive that a little bit farther home, a public bank could do affordable housing pre-development lending. What that would look like would be a short-term loan, maybe 2 or 3 years for a nonprofit, a CDFI, to buy a piece of land, to buy existing affordable housing that's at risk of being torn down and redeveloped as condos or what have you. That type of funding for like community land trusts as well is really inaccessible right now. Banks will give you a 40-year mortgage to buy an existing property, but they're much less likely to give you a construction loan, and they're far less likely to give you money just to go out and quote unquote tie up a property, which means that it's the Blackstones and the Starwoods and the big private equity names who are able to move much more quickly because their capital is A, cheaper, and B, quicker. Also on the affordable housing side, I think we saw in the state of California a lot of assistance programs being spun up, right? And there's I think about $5 billion worth of rental assistance, 90% of which is untapped in this state. And a large part of that comes down to there not being a mechanism for doling that money out. Right now, there's very few institutions that are actually set up to distribute that kind of aid, which speaks to what Jackie had just pointed out in Thomas Marwah's paper in terms of distributive aid as well. There's an infrastructural need for that. So I want to turn, and then the last piece I'll say on affordable housing, and then I want to talk briefly about small businesses as well, is there's a lot more attention being paid right now to tenant opportunity to purchase acts. There's one in DC, there's one, a nascent one in Seattle. What that means is it gives tenants the opportunity to dictate a little bit of their future. They bring in a developer, and that developer has to sell the tenants on, we will redevelop this property, we'll invest money in upgrading your floors and your appliances and your sinks, and you'll be able to stay. They have to be convinced of that. But it's not a true tenant to opportunity to purchase act. It's not like the tenants become owners, right? Nowhere in the country is there a program that allows the tenants to effectively become owners. And a large part of that comes down to the capital. There is no capital available. There's no bank saying, tenants association of this building, we trust you, here's some money to go buy your building. There are only banks saying, developers, we trust you. So that component of access to credit is fundamentally important for affordable housing, but it's also important for small businesses. Just to give an example on that front, there's during the pandemic, a lot of CDFIs were able to distribute some aid through an existing institution in the state of California called the Infrastructure Bank, or the iBank. And the way they did that for small businesses was through underwriting standards. Underwriting standards is just a way of saying, if you check a certain number of boxes, we will issue you this loan. You can think about it in terms of a credit score, but it doesn't have to be. In the case of a lot of this pandemic aid, it was micro businesses run by persons of color or in a disadvantaged community. And a micro business, by the way, is like 10 people or fewer. So this type of targeted capital, banks also don't want to make those kinds of loans, because it turns out that making 100 loans to street vendors is far more complicated and far less appealing than making one loan to a chain restaurant, and farther up the chain, right? At the same time, we as a society love to tout the importance of small businesses as the drivers to our economy, but we're not making that financing available. Things like underwriting standards saying, if you're a bank, if you're another bank and you make loans like this, I will buy those loans, or I will guarantee those loans. That's what the public bank can do. They can take off some of the balance sheet of another lender, or they can guarantee some of that money, or they can also facilitate a bond issuance. These are all things that were on the chart that Jackie just presented as well. By filling in a gap, it's not necessarily even purely anti-Wall Street, because Wall Street doesn't care, is the fact. Wall Street doesn't have any interest in making these loans. They will absolutely try to stop something like a public bank, and I've heard that in so many words, and we know that. That said, Wall Street doesn't derive profit from these. That's not to say they're not profitable. They're just not interested. The last thing I want to talk about is this idea of cost of capital, which I think we've all talked about a little bit. Right now, the way that our financial system is set up, even Jackie had pointed out that the city of San Francisco has about $10 billion. City of LA has about $11 billion in their annual budget, half of which, same thing at the state, $100 billion, half of it is spent on treasuries, basically bonds. even the federal government, when they want to issue bonds, they're not going to the state of California or the city of San Francisco or city of LA. They're going to one of 11 banks, and they're saying, hey, will you sell these for me? And from there, the banks make a profit on the selling of the bonds. The states then buy the bonds. Banks are fundamentally our entire financial infrastructure. So that means that if a state wants to take out a loan, they have to go to a bank. They can't go to the Federal Reserve directly. If there's any local initiative that wants to support affordable housing, small businesses, et cetera, give access to credit in underserved communities, 1 in 4 Californians who are underbanked, they don't have the vehicle to do that at the cost that banks do. And we see that throughout throughout these number of industries, and as well as the provision of basically any social good. A bond issuance for a small school district can cost them 15%. In Mariposa County schools paid 15% of a few $1 million bond issuance, which means that they're spending all that money just to get more money and then to go into debt. I want that to be the center point around this discussion, because that, I think, is what galvanized me to be a part of this movement, in realizing that we don't really have any public option when it comes to our financial infrastructure. I'll leave it at that.
Sorry, I'm really failing on this. I was like, am I still on mute? Thanks, Naveen. Lastly, Julian, we see the successful campaign in California and the state campaigns happening in different parts of the country. But also, AOC and Rashida Tlaib introduced the Public Banking Act in the last Congress and plan to do so this Congress as well. Can you tell us a bit about that bill and also the national organizing efforts that are both around but existing at the same time?
Yeah. So I'll get to the federal bill, the Public Banking Act, but really I want to start with talking about the national organizing efforts, because this federal bill grew out of that. After we passed AB 857 here in California, several states started replicating that effort. There was a Public Banking Act in New York State to essentially create the same kind of framework, legalizing the establishment of municipal public banks. And so we wanted to really help connect the dots and build this kind of focus on coalition building to energize and organize a grassroots movement and actually turn these demands into action. And so we formed the National Public Banking Alliance so that we could kind of export our successes here in California to other states. There are coalitions active all around the country. I know there's New York, there's like Chicago, DC, Seattle, Philadelphia, Massachusetts. They're all over the place. And so we wanted to be able to make sure that we can be a resource for people and help get these bills off the ground, because California can't do it alone. And if we want to build a truly democratic, comprehensive financial system, we need to be able to create these public banks all over the country and build a robust kind of infrastructure. Unfortunately, we ran into the pandemic only a few months after we got that bill passed. And so rather than cities and states being able to focus on public banking legislation, it was fully pandemic relief at the local and state levels all over the country. And so it really kind of tabled for a year any progress on establishing public banks. And so we started working with Representative Tlaib and Ocasio-Cortez's office and crafted the Federal Public Banking Act, which was very similar to the bill created in California, which it's a regulatory framework and a support system that can help cities and states get public banks off the ground, because we really saw public banks as a vital engine for economic recovery after COVID just devastated everything. And so, basically what the Federal Public Banking Act does, there's a lot of kind of nuts and bolts to it, but what it does is the state bill requires several things like participation with the Federal Reserve, FDIC insurance, and so we kind of created very similar to the state, but like a definition of public banks and authorizing recognition at the Federal Reserve and various financial systems so that public banks would have the same access to capital that private banks do and be able to get off the ground and invest in very crucial programs like affordable housing, renewable energy, small business investment, public infrastructure, all that stuff. And yeah, so the bill was introduced at the end of last year, and yeah, it hasn't quite gained any traction quite yet, but similar to many of the biggest progressive demands, we're optimistic that we'll get to a point where we can get that moving through. But yeah, but one thing we're really trying to do is build up that kind of grassroots foundation and get people involved and organizing around public banking. And so if anyone watching is interested, you can go, we have a form at bit.ly/Netroots Public Bank. Let me just double check that real quick. It might be public banking. Yeah, Netroots Public Bank. And you can sign up and we will find the closest coalition around you so that you can help get involved and work on organizing the bill. But yeah, happy to move on to questions now.
So thanks, Julian, and thanks everyone. Really, that was like so much information to take in, and even though I am familiar with this, it's always good to get the background from folks who are actually on the ground working on this in their communities. There were a couple of questions from the audience. We have a little bit of time, so I was going to get through those, and then maybe we can close it out by making sure we reiterated ways that people could plug in that are interested. So the first question is, since the topic of the conversation is the power of public banks to accelerate progressive movement.
Oh, Manla, did you
sorry.
want to take questions from the chat, the general chat?
I was going to take both, but I can start with one of those. Sure. So sorry, Trinity. Let me start with one of the questions from the chat. We talked a bit about how public banks would help Main Street and businesses and the building of affordable housing. But one question that came from a person in the chat was, what is the role of public banks for banking individual citizens? And that's for any of the four of you that want to take that.
I can start and you guys can chime in. So 857, the bill that we passed in 2019, it actually prohibits California public banks from engaging in retail services. So the public banks that we are building in California are not retail facing, they're wholesale bank, or what we call bankers banks. And it will help the general public through participation lending. And it will work in partnership with local banks, with community banks and credit unions to extend their credit line so that they can in turn offer low-cost consumer services. So we knew that because AB 857 public banks would be banking cities and municipalities to fill in that gap. That is why we led the charge on AB 1177, which Newsom just signed, and that would help fill in the gap by creating extending basic banking services to the general public. So once that Cal Account program is implemented, the state will partner with existing financial institutions to be able to offer these no cost, no fee, no penalty basic bank account for all Californians who choose to participate.
Yeah, and I'll continue on that a little bit. I think Trinity had a great answer there. But outside of California, it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution. There are some cities and states that are banking deserts and may not have the same access, where everyone has the opportunity to get a banking account or a low-fee account. And so, like the Bank of North Dakota is one example. They do provide checking, savings, lending to individual consumers, while California is not capable of doing that. And so it's really kind of a state-by-state, city-by-city decision of kind of how they feel it works best for the communities in their jurisdictions. And so I kind of see public banking through the lens of California, where we very much at the wholesale level of investing in larger projects and partnering with credit unions and community banks to provide the consumer services, while also programs like many are probably familiar with postal banking, which would be able to provide free banking type services to the average consumer just by going to their post office. And so I think all of these programs can complement each other.
Yep. Thanks, Julian. Actually, another question came through the chat specifically about why not use public banks to help the unbanked and why rely on the U.S. Postal Service. And I think you just addressed that. I would just add that there's already a postal service infrastructure in a lot of rural and hard to reach areas that have been historically underbanked for a long time. So it kind of makes sense for these two things to work together. We have public banks, but we also have postal banking that would serve areas that public banks are not really there in and could not like just drop into that may not have that infrastructure. I don't know if anyone wanted to add to that, or we could move to the next question.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add like that. As a public banking movement, we definitely see postal banking as allied public institutions, and their efforts are definitely complementary to what we're working on with municipal banking. But it comes down to political feasibility. It is much easier to move things at the local level, at the city, municipal, regional, state level, than, as we all know, as it is to move things at the federal level. So within just the last 2 years, we've already passed 2 bills on public banking in California, and we are already on our way to implementing those bills. It's going to take, we're supportive of the federal efforts, but it's a lot more tricky as far as maneuvering politics at that level. So we will continue to be supportive of it, but because we do see the benefit, the Postal Service already has the infrastructure there to be able to offer, low-cost consumer services. So if that comes onto line, that can certainly work in partnership with local public banks.
Thank you for that, Trinity. I think so. We have about enough time for maybe one more question. So I will take the general question, which I think folks answered throughout this, but it may be helpful to give folks just a bite-sized version. So, how does a public bank interact with and fuel progressive movements?
I'm happy to jump in. I think a big part of this is to me, it goes back to this idea of financial infrastructure in the same way that physical infrastructure like roads enable all sorts of things, commerce, emergency assistance, people get into work, right? Public banking is about creating a public financial infrastructure that enables the better provision of public good. A lot of it comes down to this idea of capital and where is capital allocated right now. In no surprise, in a capitalist society, capitalist economy, capital is allocated towards the pursuit of more capital. It's interesting, however, to note that it doesn't really have to be set up that way. And I think that the crux of this is always, and in my career has always been, it has to be set up this way. There's never a question around why is it set up this way. And it's not, I'm not talking about, to be honest, I'm not talking about a communist revolution, even a socialist revolution. I'm talking about something much simpler than that, which is access to the Federal Reserve. Again, that only happens through commercial banks, and creating public banks that have access to the Federal Reserve and can actually access their overnight lending rate, which is basically near zero right now. That makes capital much more affordable for a host of things. And unlike a private bank, a public bank will have a public mandate. So when it comes to the provision of any number of social goods, we will be able to ask it of that. Right now, what we have is a variety of sticks and carrots for private banks. The biggest one is the Community Reinvestment Act that says, hey, through this opaque process, we can evaluate commercial banks based on how good they are to the community. And it's a totally gameable system with no transparency, to be quite candid. what this offers is a public mandate, so that we're again we're not just rewarding profit-seeking behavior. And that's why I think any social cause, any progressive movement needs to be thinking about public financial infrastructure. And I think that this movement will continue to grow as we broaden that coalition and as that awareness continues to build.
Thank you. That was definitely great. I'm gonna just move to the next person because we don't have a lot of time. So I'll give you some feedback later. But thank you, Julian.
Yeah, I kind of sit in like, how can we apply? What kinds of programs do we want to see? I know nationally, there's a lot of discussion around like around Green New Deal, around affordable housing, and so public banks would create a public. I mean, it's already been described over and over. It's a public financial institution that is investing in social good rather than profit maximization. So they can provide free to no cost access to debt so that governments and nonprofits and affordable housing developers can build the projects they need to. We can invest in retrofitting buildings to decarbonize our energy grid. One thing I'm particularly very interested in, Naveen, you mentioned earlier the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. I'm very interested in how do you apply that to the workplace? How do you create a workers' right to purchase, where workers, if with a public bank, they would be afforded the capital to buy their employer and turn it into a co-op. And there's basically infinite applications if you think of how capital works to maximize profit for shareholders and CEOs. How do we create the programs that we want to invest in to build a society that we want to live in? And so if we want to finance infrastructure, build housing, build renewable energy, democratize the economy, a public bank is kind of a key first step to getting there.
Yeah, and I'll just add that we see public banking as a real cornerstone of the progressive movement, and what we're witnessing right now is this real shift towards away from privatization of services towards public ownership. And we're seeing that with banking, public banking, with utilities, with healthcare, with public housing. You know, there's a real kind of social consciousness awakening towards moving towards a system that serves the people. And so this really has a powerful intersection with progressive issues, as Julian and Naveen mentioned, with housing and green energy. At the end of the day, for-profit developers don't have an incentive to create low-income housing, and the city we can't depend on private developers to address the basic human need and right to affordable housing. Just as we can't depend on the fossil fuel industry to take us to net zero carbon. A public bank, we could fund community land trusts and build public housing at considerably lower costs. And that would reduce our reliance on federal funds and expanding access to public housing. With green energy, as Jackie had touched on in her presentation, a network of 400 municipal banks in Germany, the Sparkasse network of public banks, was able to finance over 70% of their green energy transition. And over the last 20 years, Germany's achieved about 40% of its energy from solar. So the potential for public banks to accelerate progressive movements is so profound. And I think that is why we're seeing such a wide, our coalition has really spread across the board, from social justice groups to environmental justice groups to housing rights activists to immigrant rights activists. CDFIs have jumped on, community banks, labor have joined us. It is such a powerfully, fundamentally transformative movement, and it's really incredibly exciting to see the acceleration of this movement and its ability, hopefully soon, to be able to power us through the green energy revolution and the social housing revolution and every other institution, every other infrastructure that we need to rebuild. I think the future is here. The future of finance is certainly here.
Well, thanks, Trinity, for kind of bringing that all together. At this point, we are going to close because we are running out of time and we don't want the thing to just cut on us. A couple things I wanted to just pub quickly. There is Vivian Chang put the interest form to connect about public banking in the chat. So please feel free to sign up there. And also, Arlene Baker had a great question here that we're unfortunately not going to have time to get to today. But when we go ahead and say our organizations or our Twitter handles, I'm sure that someone could follow up with you about that, and we can take it from there. So first, I'll go first, and then I'll Naveen, do you want to go first, and then we'll go around just your organization, how people can keep in contact with you, and how to get people involved.
I'll yield my time to Trinity, actually.
Perfect.
Reach out to us at California Public Banking Alliance, calpba@gmail.com, or check us out at publicbankla.com or publicbankla.org. Also publicbankla@gmail.com, or tweet at us at publicbankla. And I'm Transcends on Twitter.
And Julie?
Private messages though.
Yeah, you can find us. I'm with SF Public Bank and National Public Banking Alliance. That's on Twitter. It's at SF Public Bank. On Twitter, it's at Public Banks US. And if you go to that bit.ly link, bit.ly/Netroots Public Bank, that'll lead you to the forum, and myself and Trinity will follow up with everyone who fills that out. And whether you're in California or anywhere in the country, we'll do our best to get you connected with a local organization, or if you're interested, forming a new one. And we'll help you organize a coalition and build that foundation all up. Yeah.
Definitely. And lastly, again, I'm Mandela. I'm with Take on Wall Street. We are a national coalition. TakeOnWallST.org or .com. Take on Wall Street on Twitter. And we look forward to working with all of you and these great organizers, advocates, leaders on this panel as we move forward to create the economy that we need for working people. And with that, we will thank you all for joining us today, and hope you enjoy the rest of the Netroots Nation.
Bye all. Thank you.